German elections, what the results mean, and what comes next. I'd now like to introduce our two speakers for today. Our first speaker is Hope Harrison. Dr. Harrison is a professor of history and international affairs at GW. She has written 3 books about the Berlin Wall in Germany during and after the Cold War, including about the lingering East-West divide nearly 35 years after German unification. Dr. Harrison has lived in Germany multiple times, including with prestigious fellowships from Fulbright and the American Academy in Berlin. She also has a media presence in American and European news outlets. The second speaker today is Hilary Silver, a professor of sociology, international affairs, and public policy and public administration at GW. She is a recipient of 2 Fulbright fellowships, multiple DAAD grants, and other awards for her research in Germany. She studies the social integration of Berlin and neighborhood life in the east and west of the still divided city. Before we get started, we ask that you hold your questions until the end of the discussion, and I will now turn the discussion over to Dr. Harrison.
Thank you so much, Abby. It's great to have you join us. So welcome, everyone. I'm speaking to you from the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs. We're happy to be with you to talk about these really consequential German elections, not just for Germany, but for Europe and the world. These elections last Sunday came amid dramatic developments, both domestically and externally to Germany. Domestically, the elections came 2 years into a recession and after a spate of violent attacks in Germany perpetrated by immigrants and asylum seekers. Externally, the elections came at a time when it is a crisis really for Europe, with the new Trump administration reaching out kind of over the heads of the Europeans to Vladimir Putin. The Europeans have been, for the most part, and certainly the Germans have been second only to the US in the amount of aid they have offered to Ukraine, both militarily and in terms of humanitarian aid. So 3 years into Russia's war on Ukraine, with Trump suddenly, for the US, in many ways switching sides, puts Germany and Europe in a very key moment in history. I would say that the moment Germany is facing now is the biggest challenge it has faced since uniting in 1990. So there were 3 big issues up in the elections, and these will be the challenges for the government as it tries to, as the CDU and SPD try to form a coalition. The 3 issues have been immigration, the economy, and the war in Ukraine. The economy, as I said, has been stagnant for 2 years. There's a budget deficit of 13 billion euros. There's been years of lack of investment in infrastructure and R&D. Germans were once dominant in the automobile market, but now Chinese electric cars are flooding the market. So there have been basic structural problems in the economy. These were added to by Russia's war in Ukraine, and the way Germany has stepped up its military spending at home and in Ukraine. So the elections saw a record turnout of 82.5% of the vote, with 4/5 of the voters very concerned about the state of Germany. Leading into the elections, the main party that's been in opposition for the past 4 years, the Christian Democratic Union, looked in the polls like it was going to get 28 to 30%, and that was accurate. It looked in the polls like the far right Alternative for Germany was going to get about 20%, and that turned out to be accurate too. So let me show you how things turned out. You can see on the left the share of the vote each party got. You can see the Black, the Christian Democratic Union, led by Friedrich Merz, as expected, came in first. As expected by people who were watching it, but maybe a shock to more people, was the fact that the far right AfD got nearly 21% of the vote. And in fact, it doubled its electoral success over the past 4 years. The current government for the past 4 years has been led by the SPD in red, the Greens, and the FDP yellow. As I note at the bottom of that slide, in 2021, that coalition that's been ruling for 4 years had 52% of the vote. But in last Sunday's election, they dropped 20%. So a massive change in the electoral landscape in Germany. They have, if the two, as planned, in fact, today, the Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democrats have started coalition talks. In Germany, it's a very different system than in the US. No party can rule alone in this parliamentary democracy. It always has to be a coalition. And coalition talks began today between the Black and the Red, the CDU and the SPD, with the SPD playing kind of hard to get, even because they're trying to have some bargaining power, even though they lost. This was their worst election outcome since World War II. So they have begun talking. You can see here on the left is Friedrich Merz, the leader of the CDU. In the top right, the picture of the two men. On the left is Olaf Scholz, who has been the German chancellor for the past 4 years. He has pulled out. He is not involved in the coalition negotiations, which are being led by the man next to him, Lars Klingbeil, the head of the party. Also a strong member of the SPD coalition is the SPD politician who's been the most popular, Boris Pistorius, who has been the defense minister. But of course, the big story so many people are watching is the far right Alternative for Germany doubling its vote over the past 4 years. On the left, you see the picture of the two leaders. The chancellor candidate was the woman, Alice Weidel. You see her on the right speaking at a big rally in January, where Elon Musk joined and has been a very vocal supporter of the AfD, as has Vice President Vance when he was in Munich a couple of weeks ago, as has Trump. So who is this party and why have they become so popular? And how does their popularity differ between the East and the West? Well, this party was formed actually by West German economists and professors in 2013 um, as a way to say, in response to Chancellor Angela Merkel's view that Germany should help bail out countries like Greece and Portugal from the euro debt crisis. She said, we need to keep the EU together. We can do this. We need to help them. There is no alternative. And they formed a party saying, actually, there is an alternative. And we're calling our party Alternative for Germany. Our alternative is we don't use our money to help other countries. We keep our money at home. So that's how they started in 2013. But that didn't get them into the Bundestag. To get into the parliament, you have to pass a 5% hurdle. And they didn't in the 2013 elections. But in the 2017 elections, following 2 years after the refugee crisis, brought in over 1 million refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and elsewhere to Germany, which Germany had welcomed, the AfD pivoted to focusing on anti-immigration, anti-asylum, really anti-foreigner, racist, kind of Germany is for ethnic and Christian Germans. In 2021, they didn't do as well. They got 10.4% of the vote, but this time they doubled it. Now, many people ask, well, they came in number two. Aren't they going to be in the government with Merz? And the answer is no, because all of the other parties has said there is a firewall. We are not going through that firewall because they are neo-Nazis. Due to the history of the Holocaust and World War II, we cannot allow a party like that to be in the federal government. To which the AfD and their 20% of the German voters, joined by Musk and Vance, say, what kind of a democracy is this when you right away rule out 1/5 of the electorate being represented in the government? So Alice Weidel has said we will win the next elections. She's already calling Merz of the CDU a temporary or provisional chancellor. She will clearly try to split the CDU itself between its more conservative parts and its less conservative parts and try to split whatever coalition is formed. Now, in town hall meetings, Alice Weidel has been asked a few times how her personal life, where she is married to a woman from Sri Lanka and they have 2 children. Many people have said, how does this jive with your anti-immigrant, kind of anti-foreigner approach, which also says same-sex marriage shouldn't be legal? And she just completely dodges that question when she was asked on the campaign trail. Also, it should be known that some of the far-right parliamentarians being brought in this election are quite far-right and using Nazi slogans that makes the 80% of the German voters very worried and has led to demonstrations over the past month of tens of thousands of Germans on the streets against the far right. So Another really important outcome of this election, or reflection of the reality in Germany of this election, is how deeply and vividly and kind of sadly it portrays the lasting legacy of 40 years of Germany being divided between communist East and democratic West Germany. Germany united in 1990. It's been 35 years. But if you look at these two maps, you see absolutely clearly the difference in voting patterns. All the states, except for Berlin, in the former East, you see are blue for the AfD. The AfD won all of them. It didn't win a single one in the West. In the West, you see some pockets of red for the Social Democrats and some pockets of green. So why has the East been so much more supportive of the AfD? The AfD overall in the East got 34.5% of the vote, whereas in the West, it got just under 18% of the vote. Well, economics has been a more negative picture in the East. People earn less, they have less savings, there's higher unemployment. The majority of the people there lost their job at least once in the 1990s after unification. There's much less integration of that part of the country into the Western-dominated United Germany. That part, the East, feels closer historic ties to Russia and more suspicion of the US and NATO. And in the East, in general, parties and citizens voted more for the extremes, the far right and the far left, than for the mainstream, long-standing German parties, which they clearly don't feel represent them and don't feel an allegiance to. Also, anti-immigration feelings, racist feelings are higher in the East, and that is partly because in the communist East, there was much less training of citizens to understand sort of the racist origins of the Holocaust and to really come to terms with that. In the East, it was seen the communists were the main victims of the Nazis, not the Jews. So they've been much less exposed to anti-racist education and political culture in the East. And finally, in the 35 years since unification, there has been a sense that on the part of many in the East that astonishingly has gotten worse, not better, a sense that they're treated as second-class citizens. And the AfD really played on this in its campaigns. It focused really strongly in the East. Their campaign posters said things like, take your country back. And some of the posters just said East, or the East rises up. So this divide is really problematic, and the new government is going to have to deal with this. Friedrich Merz himself, he's 69 years old, the man who will be the next chancellor. He was in the European Parliament in the Bundestag before being sort of pushed out by Angela Merkel in the same party. He then became a millionaire as a lawyer and a lobbyist. He pilots his own private jet. He's kind of cocky, sort of big ego and short fuse. So on the one hand, people have definitely wanted a stronger leader than Schultz because for the past 4 years, Schultz hasn't displayed really a lot of leadership qualities, and Merz is eager to step right in there. But whether he can do that without ruffling a lot of feathers, first in coalition negotiations and then second in working with the EU, we will see. Um, so two final points before I turn it over to my colleague and friend, Hilary Silver. There are several important disagreements that the CDU and SPD are going to have to work out in these coalition negotiations, which may take the better part of 2 months. How to recharge the economy, because it's absolutely clear that, to persuade voters in the next election in 4 years not to vote for the far right, they have got to fix problems with the economy and with the issue of keeping track of immigration, limiting it, integrating people better, knowing, tracking people in the system when their request for asylum has been denied, making sure that they don't stay in the country. They disagree about how to do these things. They disagree about how to jumpstart the economy. The CDU wants big tax cuts, including for corporations. The SPD favors more government spending. They agree in many ways on the war in Ukraine and supporting Ukraine, having a strong European role in peace talks. Um, so there are certainly some things they agree on, but they've got a lot of details to work out. And the new government cannot ever be formed in Germany until they sign off agreeing on all their major policies. It's usually a very long document that has everybody's signatures on it, and only then can the government take charge. So, 5 challenges ahead is my final comment. Number one, they need to form a stable coalition as soon as possible. Number two, they need to find a way to boost the economy such that Germans really feel an improvement over the next 4 years. They need to do a much better job of handling issues with regard to immigration, and they need to increase defense expenditures and help bring together a joint European defense at this moment when Merz himself said that Trump has seemingly thrown aside the transatlantic relationship, doesn't seem to care about Europe, and that Europe is on its own, stuck between an aggressive, militarily aggressive Putin to their east and a disappearing American ally with a nuclear umbrella and many troops to the west. And the final challenge for the new government, of course, is this pressure from the far right AFD and their voters, and the AFD backers in Moscow and Washington. So it's a tall order. With that, I will turn it over to Professor Hilary Silver.
I'm going to unmute. Hi, everybody. I'm going to focus in on a few of the social and local aspects of the German election. And I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to try to share with you now. Here we go. So I'd like to focus. Let me see if I can get it to be full screen. Just a moment. There we go. There it is. Everybody can see, I hope. So I wanted to focus in on several, maybe we might call them details of the election, and to draw some implications from the local the local results. Okay, so here is a picture, as Hope was just showing you, Professor Harrison was just showing you the share of seats in the Bundestag that the CDU union with the CSU took 1/3 of the votes, and followed by these are the number of seats in the Bundestag, not the size of the votes, but you can see that the CDU did better than in the last election. The AfD doubled its support, but the big losers here were what we call the Ampel coalition, the streetlight coalition, traffic light coalition of the red, green, yellow, the Social Democrats, Greens, and Free Democrats. And the Bundestag now has simplified somewhat into 5 parties. As you can see, some of the smaller ones didn't make the 5% threshold. In addition, Professor Harrison noted how important the distinction between the former 5 states of the German Democratic Republic, the communist 40 years of German division. But what I wanted to point out here is these are economic disparities. And as you can see, Berlin sort of stands out in economic terms, at least in terms of the youth population and the unemployment rates. They also stand out, as I'll show you in a minute, with respect to the vote. But this is important because young people had a big role to play in some of the election results. Okay, so what we saw is that the Alternativen für Deutschland, I'll just call it the AfD for abbreviation, they came in first in all of those eastern states, except in Berlin. And the only place in Berlin where AfD came in first was one district in the east called Marzahn-Hellersdorf. But in all of the districts of Berlin, it did better than it did in previous elections. It improved. But the big surprise in this election was how well the left, or Die Linke, did in this election. For the first time, winning the most votes of any party in the election, and winning 4 of the 6 direct mandates nationwide in Berlin. 2 in the east of the city, Treptow, Kopenhagen, and Lichtenberg. 1 in the combined unified constituency of Friedrichshain, Kreuzberg with Prenzlauer Berg East, and even carrying a district for the first time in the West, namely in Berlin-Neukölln. And what I'd like to do is focus in on how the Linke won. And some of the factors I'll point to are the demographic breakdown of the vote, party positions on the issues, the campaign tactics that were used by the Linke, and the candidates themselves. So, as I said, the Berlin results were very surprising, as you can see from this photo, these pictures. Since 2017, you can see the ever-growing success of the AfD in the East, in the former East. But in Berlin, as you see, in this last election, they only took this small eastern section of Marzahn-Hellersdorf. And instead, what we see is that this entire swath of purple, violet is that of the Linke, the former Communist Party, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. The Greens continued to hold the highly educated and governmental district in the center of the city. And towards the left, you see the bourgeois districts, Charlottenburg and Stieglitz, remain controlled by the Christian Democrats, and then the socialists took the far west of the city. If you wanted to see over time who ruled the state of Berlin, you can see here the party representation that the Social Democrats in general controlled the Senate, the parliament of the entire federal state of Berlin. With some exceptions, the Christian Democrats took the election and the mayoralty, I guess you'd call it. So what we want to ask, who voted how? So I'm a political sociologist, so I'm very interested in the demographics of the vote, and you can see who voted left, who voted right. So there wasn't much of a difference in terms of gender, except for the AfD. The AfD continues to be dominated by men. In terms of social class or education, people with a lower education were twice as likely to vote for the AfD than those with advanced degrees. People who are highly educated tend to vote for the Greens, as you saw in the middle of Berlin, and the left party that I'll get to, I'm going to focus on for most of my presentation. Age is perhaps the most important demographic in this election because 25% of young people, 18 to 24, voted for the Linke. And that went up 17 points. And similarly, for the 25 to 34-year-olds, 16% were more likely to vote did vote for the Linke, which is much more likely than people who are older. Other age groups, the Linke did not really win a lot of support. And the question is why. This has a big role to play in the explanation for why the Linke did well. But before I get there, I want to say something about migrants themselves. You know, over time, we forget very often that the migrant population and those with what is called migrant background have increased in citizenship and therefore the right to vote. So if there was this year a poll by the German Center for Integration and Migration Research, DETSIM, that found that migrants, people with immigrant background, especially from Turkey and the Middle East, tended to sympathize with the left. That's to say, with the Linke or with the BSW, which I'll explain in a little bit who they are, but they're a schism or a fringe, a breakaway party from the Linke. But as a whole, immigrants as a whole still preferred the SPD. You know, and that means that, you know, Berlin was basically a SPD bastion, really, as I showed you before, over time, until 2024. You can see here the woman in the red jacket, that's Francesca Giffey, who was mayor just before the last Social Democratic mayor, but Kai Wegner took over in 2023. Berlin had to do several do-over elections after the previous federal election, partly because there were just so many irregularities in Berlin. But anyway, Kai Wegner of the CDU is now the overall mayor of the state of Berlin. And he made a coalition, and there are 10 senators in the state that take care of a variety of central administrative activities and make up each party in the coalition gets to control some of these. So in the Berlin House of Representatives, there are 52 seats that the CDU has, but the Social Democrats have 34. And the left still had 22, which is important. they are in Berlin still represented. They've long had a stronghold in the eastern districts of Berlin. The Bezirk within Berlin are districts that are responsible for local affairs. And each one of them has a borough assembly, the BVV, and a borough office in the Bezirksamt, similarly with a borough president and councilors. So just so you know how it works. And it is not letting me there. So the Linke had a great success in this last election in Berlin. It won nationally, it won 8.8% of the votes and got 64 seats in the Bundestag, all in Berlin, except for two violent constituencies that won in Leipzig and in Erfurt, Weimar, which are university towns, and the party's leaders, Ramalov and Pellman, did well as direct candidates. One of the things about the election in Germany, if you're not familiar, is there's a first ballot and a second ballot. And the first ballot, you vote for a candidate, and on the second, for a party. So the Linke were able to enter parliament previously by winning in these small constituencies on the first ballot. And these folks were already in the Bundestag through this way. And so the party had a very strong incentive to focus in on particular constituencies, because in this way they would continue to have a representative in the Bundestag. But what was really surprising in this election was that the left actually came ahead of all the other parties in the city-state of Berlin for the first time. It got 21.8% of the first votes and 19.9% of the second votes. And it was uneven across the various districts, the Bezirk. But as you'll see, they got 23% in Lichtenberg, which is in the east, and 25% in Neukölln, which is in the west. And I'm going to focus in on this because these are my two study areas when I'm doing my research in Berlin. So let me quickly just say a few things about who the Linke are, because just as Professor Harrison just talked about who the AfD is, it's important to know who the Linke are. This party is a radical left-wing party with some former East German communists, founded in 2007, actually, when they merged with the successor to the German Democratic Republic's Communist Party, the SED. Their successor after reunification was called the Party of Democratic Socialism, or the PDS. And the PDS then merged with an electoral alternative for labor and social justice from the West, and they formed the left party. And traditionally, they had a lot of support in the East, especially in Berlin-Lichtenberg. So I want to tell you about a couple things about what happened to the party over time, or in the recent past. So while on the one hand they had a stronghold in Lichtenberg, many people thought that the left was dead, was going to collapse in this election, because last year a faction within the left, led by Sarah Wagenknecht, left the Linke to form her own alliance, the BSW. And it ran successfully as an anti-migration, pro-Russian party. And it did quite well in 3 federal states in last year's state elections. And really surprised everybody by how well they did. But this time in the 2025 election, they just missed the 5% threshold. And so they're not going to be seated in the Bundestag, even though they got 10 to 12% in most of the eastern states. And so they can serve in coalitions there, but only at the state level, not in the Bundestag. In Berlin, the most support that it received, the BSW received, was 10% in Lichtenberg and also 10% or 11% in Marzahn. These are the two most eastern states. But the Left Party, when this faction left, the Left Party actually was able to unite ideologically, and so particularly on social class issues. And so you can see that if you look at the party vote here, the Linke did really well. You can see the Peaked, they improved their vote in Berlin as a result of the change. So if you say, well, how did the Linke win? And I'm going to give you some explanations, I hope, for this. So first of all, the party surged because young voters voted for them. As I said, they increased their share of the vote. They got 25% of 18 to 24-year-olds, 16% of 25 to 34-year-olds, where the other groups were in the single digits, other age groups. And one reason for this, many people, observers say, is because younger voters have no memory, really, of the Communist Party, of the dictatorship of the GDR. And so they are less, the firewall that exists against the neo-Nazis doesn't really exist in the same way for young people against the communists. But that kind of revulsion exists for the older generations in the East. There's still some of that feeling. In addition, as you'll see, the younger voters were more social media savvy, and they were discontented with the older candidates of the conventional people's parties, Schultz and Merz. So the left gained votes both from the Social Democrats and the Greens considerably. Like when you look at the migration of the votes, you can see in the last election, people who voted left were more likely to vote for the center. So how did they win? Well, in addition to the demography, which is to say young people supported them, they won because of the kinds of issues that they championed. For example, first of all, they said, we have to defeat the AfD. And the AfD became sort of the boogeyman that allowed the Linke to say, we're the last bastion against the far right. And, their opposition was strong. So people who were concerned and worried that the AfD might take over in the eastern districts swung to the Linke rather than going to the BSW. The party without the BSW was pro-migration. But, as you'll see, one of the things that happened during the campaign was that Merz decided that he was going to win votes from the AfD by putting forward an anti-migration, a strict anti-migration bill in the Bundestag that was supported by the AfD, and that therefore he was seen as having appealed for votes from the AfD itself in the parliament to pass this anti-migration bill. And even some of the CDU members of parliament voted against it. But as a result, even Angela Merkel broke her silence and criticized this breaking of the firewall to rely on the AfD. Whereas the Linke, and unlike BSW, that is anti-migration and tended to try to pull votes from the AfD on migration, the Linke were pro-migration. And so people who wanted to have a protest vote against the Ampel parties and not vote for the far right often saw the Linke as a viable alternative. And the Linke party ran on issues of social justice. They wanted big tax hikes on the rich. They focused on protecting social benefits and pensions against austerity budgets. The Senate of Berlin had cut the local budget considerably, and people were upset. And they also emphasized rent, also emphasized rent in and the inflation, just like on Trump did, right? Like, pocketbook issues. They rethought the AfD Defense Alliance, of course. They're still left, and a lot of those folks are still under the influence of Russian culture, but they really focused a lot on local issues. I'm being told that I should go fast, but I don't know what time it is. All right, so a few other things to say about why the Linke did well. I'll try to get through this quickly. One has to do with their campaign tactics. They were very successful in districts where they actually did door-to-door door knocking campaigns, and they got all these young volunteers to show up and knock on doors. They worked the streets. They set up tables. They organized district meetings. They set up spaces where people could talk about politics. They used social media. Like they put this old Linke representative, Gysi, on TikTok. They campaigned in ethnic neighborhoods like the Dong Xuang Centrum, where they appealed for Vietnamese votes. So you can see these are some of the local candidates. Not only were they looking for votes from the old communist in Treptow, Gregor Gysi, who was elected 6 times since the reunification, but also they appealed to younger voters. And so in Lichtenberg, the PDS and the Linke had been running the place for 30 years, but the AfD put up a candidate that tried to finally defeat the Linke in Lichtenberg. It was this woman whose name is Beatrix von Storch. She has a very long name, actually, who is an aristocrat. And she's one of the most famous AfD supporter Bundestag members. And she not only nobility and came from the West, from Oldenburg, but she attended Trump's inauguration. And she was up against Ines Schwertner, who was the leader who was anointed or endorsed by the longtime representative of Lichtenberg, Gesine Lutsch, who was in the Bundestag she was elected 6 times. So this was a very local campaign, and they portrayed it as one of good against evil, Linke against AfD, and sure enough, she won. And the idea is also that the SPD could not hold where they traditionally had support. And Merz too is very unpopular in Berlin. So he made some really racist remarks, like in January of 2023, Merz had said, people who actually have no business in Germany, who we've here for a long time, who we don't send back, who we don't deport, and then we're surprised when there are excesses like refugees who commit murders. The only other example I'm going to use, and then I'll finish, and I'm being told I don't even know what time. Okay. I will finish in a moment, is that the other big surprise was in a high migration district, Neukölln, which is in the West. And this is the first time that a West Berlin neighborhood actually was led by a Linke, a left-wing representative. So Ferit Kochak, who was in the Berlin House of Representatives, was directly elected to the Bundestag. He's of Kurdish origin, but he was born in Kreuzberg and grew up in Neukölln. And it's a neighborhood where there were many pro-Palestinian demonstrations and a large Arab population. And he ran on anti-racism and social justice issues as well. So to conclude, what are some of the implications? Berlin is exceptional in the East. That also, it's very important to have a Black-Red federal coalition that will hold and be stable, as Professor Harrison said, given the fact that there's been success on both extremes, on the right and the left. And finally, this election provides us with lessons, provides the center with lessons about how to run a successful campaign and respond to citizens' concerns. And that's that. And stop share. And there's time for questions.
Yes, if you have any questions, feel free to send them through the chat and we'll be sure to monitor them. Thank you.
You can also raise your digital hand.
Emma Ulvin asks, what do you think the implications will be for the war in Ukraine?
Well, it may be that the war in Ukraine is out of Germany and Europe's hands. Zelensky's in Washington today to sign a deal on giving over half of its mineral resources to the United States. Trump and Putin have been negotiating directly. So far, Europe hasn't had a seat at the table. Merz has met with Macron, but without a government in place, there's not a lot Germany can do. So, in the short term, if there is a ceasefire, right now, the only way the Europeans seem to be perhaps going to be involved is a question of whether there are peacekeeping troops on the ground in Ukraine. Now, when Merz was asked about this the night after he won the election, he said it's too soon to talk about this. So, I mean, it's a very tough call for Germany because the German invasion of the Soviet Union in World War II went right through Ukraine. So having German troops in Ukraine is something that a lot of Germans would be very wary of. Really, there's incredible frustration on the part of Germans and Europeans that something that is so incredibly important to European security right now is being decided above their heads between Moscow and the US, with now finally Ukraine involved. So we'll see. Other questions?
Is the firewall against AfD dangerous in potentially further radicalizing those who feel that their concerns aren't being addressed by mainstream parties, particularly in the East? Is Die Linke a viable alternative to AfD outside of Berlin?
Well, I'm sure we both have things to say about that. Yes, keeping this firewall against having them in the government raises questions about democracy. But the Germans, the majority of Germans, at least for now, say, look, the principle of learning from our history and being staunchly anti-Nazi, anti-racist is an essential part of our democracy. Like that's sort of the argument that the AfD isn't a Democratic Party. Now, how far that goes is another question, but that's their argument that this is sort of the mainstream argument that they are absolutely not in support of what we would call a free and open democracy, and that they threaten it, which is all the more why the coalition that ultimately is formed has really got to come through on economic issues and issues with regard to migration so that that 20% doesn't grow.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things to say. Part of this has to do, I believe, that the East is under a continuing cultural influence from Russia. It's not so much even to call it a disinformation campaign, so much as to say that a lot of the people who grew up under the GDR are somewhat anti-American and do accept some of the positions of Putin uh, that the West provoked Russian intervention in Ukraine, and they accept that point of view. They even have, to some extent, are losing patience with Ukrainian refugees. At least we're seeing it in East Berlin somewhat. So there's like 1 million Ukrainians right now in Germany, and they have to be housed. In Berlin, one of the issues really is over housing. So you see a lot of tension in Berlin because a lot of refugees they have to be housed when they arrive. And there's a housing crisis in Berlin. There's no housing to be had, and rents keep going up. And so in Lichtenberg, and particularly in Marzahn, where the AfD actually outperformed the Linke, there were quite a few places of refugee accommodation that were assigned to be in the eastern states, which were seen as provocative to the neighborhood. So this is not a problem in the rest of the East. I mean, at least not yet. In principle, refugees should be assigned more or less evenly across the federal states. But in fact, the eastern states have very few. I had a slide with the picture of where the migrant population lives. I mean, the migrant population is really not in the East, even though there's a great deal of anti-migrant feeling. So really what it is that the AfD have exploited migration as an issue, but there aren't all that many migrants that they have to encounter. It's more a feeling that there's an identity called East German. People see themselves increasingly as Aussie, as having this subculture that is disrespected by the West. And the political parties like the Greens or the Social Democrats telling them how they ought to behave and what they ought to think, and that how they should welcome non-Germans. So there's a kind of it's not exactly a xenophobia so much as it is, well, what about us? It's an identity of we should get attention before all these migrants. And that's sort of what's going on, in my opinion. So that's what the AfD appeals to. So if the Linke can appeal to it, or if the center parties can appeal to it through better immigration policies or through better equalization policies, social support for the eastern states, for people who live there, who still live there, because young people, a lot of them have left, then I think that there's a possibility the AfD will lose support. Okay, we have another question from Jacob Young. The hope is that the improving economic situation of housing, overall cost, and unemployment for all Germans will distribute popular support for the AfD. From what I understand, the AfD won an equal 20% or so throughout most demographics, not just the young. Yeah, that's true. The Linke won among the young. That's I'm not suggesting that the AfD only won among the young. But they did get support, good support from younger generation too. It, it was across the board.
So I'll just make one final comment. I mean, we've come to 2 o'clock, but the parties on the extremes, the AfD and the Linke, are where people in the East are going. So, I think a new ruling coalition, if it is the CDU and SPD, part of them, even though a part of them is going to sort of hope that the Linke can continue to take some voters from the far right AfD. Economic issues are also a key reason for support for Die Linke, including among young people who say, I don't have much money. I'm a student. My rents keep going up. Grocery prices keep going up. And Die Linke are the ones who keep talking about these kinds of social justice, like economic welfare issues. In this battle between the far right and the far left, most Germans, most Germans would rather go a little bit left than a little bit right. But as we've said, really challenging times for Germany, both domestically and internationally. Once the new government is in place, presumably and hopefully before Easter, we will certainly have another event to talk about that. But we want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Hilary for joining me to talk to you all, and stay tuned. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you for joining.